this computer. Hi, how are you doing, Loretta?
Hi, Marina. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, so we are recording. We're good. So to the class, this is Loretta Lopez, who was a mentee of mine and
Mhm.
has recently published her first novel, which is a middle grade novel called City Girls. All of you by now will have read it. But I thought it would be a nice opportunity for you to get to know Loretta. And so I'm going to ask her a few questions, and then ultimately, all of you students will be able to write a question or two, or however many questions you have for Loretta after this, after you listen to this interview. So, I guess the first question I have for you was before you got into this project, was writing something that you always enjoyed or wanted to do? Did you study writing? I'm just sort of curious about background in that way.
Yeah. I have loved writing for a really long time, but I would say I really started to take it seriously when I was about 17. And that's thanks to a wonderful teacher I had in high school, Doug Parker. And we're still in touch, and he was just very encouraging and taught me that I could write longer form pieces, taught me I could write personal essays. And that's kind of when I decided I needed to study creative writing in college. Yeah. So that's when I started to take it really seriously, but I've liked it for a really long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, when you came to me, you
Mhm.
came through our mutual friend, Lauren. At the time, if I recall, you were working for Lauren's organization. Can you first sort of talk about that? And then we'll talk about how the initial story happened with respect to City Girls.
Yeah. Yeah. So you and I know each other through Lauren, the importance of networking in life. Because if not, I would have never met you, and that would have totally, like, you could totally change my life. So very happy for that connection. Yeah, Lauren and I, she's my good friend, and she's an immigration attorney. And we used to work together at a place called Safe Passage. It still exists, it's up and running. Great organization. And we would work with unaccompanied minors, or or in other words, children who come to the United States without an adult supervising them. They come on their own, as you well know, Marina, because your
Mm.
book is about that too. Um, and yeah, so that's how that was definitely the seed for City Girls. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's actually talk about that because when you came to me at that point and Lauren had shared with me the initial short story, um,
Hmm.
tell me where that came from. And actually, let's backtrack a little bit. So, Loretta,
Hmm.
you also you had been getting your degree as a social worker, right?
Hmm.
And so at that time, that was part of your work, if I'm not mistaken. So
Correct.
you
Yeah.
have this other aspect where you kind of came into contact through your work with all these kinds of stories.
Hmm.
Um, so when you first came to me, I guess you had this short story. Now, am I misremembering, but were you and Lauren both involved with the short story initially, or was it you who had just purely written it?
Yeah, so Lauren definitely gave me the idea. So Lauren is amazing. She has like a million projects all the time. She's an immigration attorney, and she was like, you know what? I'm gonna write a children's book about immigration. But and I was like, wait, I'll do it because I'm a writer, Lauren, on the side. And she's like, well, we could both do it. And I was like, yeah, this is great. So Lauren and I, the beginning stages of City Girls was like a lot of brainstorm sessions with Lauren. Um, but we were thinking like a book for elementary school children, like maybe, 5-year-olds, just kind of explaining the immigration process. I had even made drawings for the book. And it was always like the character of Elisa, who's like a combination of many girls Lauren and I know, but it's kind of like the soul of the girls that Lauren and I were working with at the time. But then as I started writing the story, it just didn't feel right as a picture book. It felt much longer. So then I kind of went off on my own and then started writing the long form, and then I wrote the short story. And then that's when I met you, and I was kind of like, what do I do with this? And you were the one who helped me um realize that I could make it a middle grade novel and I could extend it in creative ways. And I remember a key point that you helped me with, just like understanding the market too, was like I was like, well, okay, so one chapter will be Elisa, the other chapter will be her mother, the next chapter will be her boyfriend. And you're like, wait, the market actually works in a way that it's better if you write through the perspective of children throughout. And that was super key for me because I didn't know anything about the market and the publishing world at all. So those types of tips, getting them at the beginning was enormously helpful for me. And I didn't, not waste time. I'm sure I would have learned something through that process, but I was able to like focus more.
Let's talk a little bit because I have some recollection when we first were working on the Elisa story, the first story, which really came intact. You had the arc of the story. When you gave it to me, it was just absolutely beautiful, but we did work on it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
um, can you sort of share with the students some of the work we did and
Yes.
what you started to do with that initial kind of kernel?
Yeah. So the work that we did, I think the most important part that you helped me with was zooming out. Like once I started to write the other two characters and being like, okay, how is this story melting into that story and then into the other one? Like, where is Elisa going to meet Alice? Like those type of questions. Like, where are you going to insert the, you know, sparks of the other characters so that it later makes sense that they're part of the story? So that helped me a lot. And then I remember like you asking really good questions like, wait, is this take time over like a school year? And stuff like that, like helping me understand the timeline. Um, and yeah, you were so, I mean, you were definitely super helpful with like the nitty-gritty pieces too, but like extremely helpful in the larger view of it, which I think is a writer, you can get really lost in the the each sentence, and it's like no, you need to like take a step back and see that this is a full project and that everything needs to connect. And then I remember us working a lot on um would can a middle schooler think this? Is this too sad? Is this appropriate to write about? Like you really helped me with those larger, bigger picture questions. Um, yeah, because you're a writer for you have written for this age, and then also you've had kids. I haven't. So you're a mom, so that's super helpful. Um, yeah, bird's eye view sort of stuff.
Yeah, and let's talk about too, because you began with Elisa very clear in
Mm-hmm.
your mind. As you said, she was kind of she so grew organically out of the work you did. She was sort of a
Sorry.
composite of these young women that these young girls who you had a
Mm-hmm.
lot of contact with, and these stories that you heard, right?
Mhm.
And I just want to backtrack a little. I mean, all of you will have read the book, but it's really dealing with a young girl um, who has applied for asylum, and there is obviously a repressed memory. First of all, she's adjusting to being with her mother and being
Mm-hmm.
in the US. But also for her asylum application, she is going to have to remember something very painful. And part of what
Mm-hmm.
was so interesting about that first her story is the kind of childlike way she understood what happened to her, and
Yeah.
how it took a while, and that thing she did with eating. I think, in fact, if I recall, that was one of the things that you most remembered as a detail about one of the girls is how she
Mm-hmm.
kept stuffing food into her face, I think,
Yeah.
a lot, that anxiety. And that was one of
Mm-hmm.
the details you definitely brought out, right? So that character, of course, came from this very observed, lived experience for you as a social worker and working with safe passages. But then you had to grow to these other two characters.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about where they came from and
Yeah.
how is that different from starting with the initial character?
Mm-hmm. I think they did come in that order. So in the order they come in the book, that's how they came to me. So the next girl, Lucia, she really feels definitely like the one who's most like me of the story. Um, I didn't go through, my parents getting divorced when I was that age. I went through that much older, but I was just imagining what would it be like to go through that when you're 11 and how would you perceive that and what would you sense and what would you wonder about? But definitely I feel the most like her out of the girls, and it was nice to explore myself at that age and
Hmm.
kind of try to remember what I felt like at that age and the awkwardness of that age, but also like the self-awareness that is beginning to blossom at that age, the importance of friendships, like friendships become this whole other level of poignant for you at that age. So it was really nice to remember that. And then Alice is based on my cousin Ruby. So Ruby, now she's what, 23, but when she was that age, she was a lot like Alice, just like very kind of wild and free-spirited and misunderstood. And she actually did go through that. Her mother, my aunt, being diagnosed with very serious cancer and almost dying. And to her, she was just trying to, figure it out at that age and also really acting out. And yeah, like you mentioned with Elisa, I'm interested in the way that all people, but in this book, children, um, present symptoms of different, of anxiety or depression. Like, what is that actually like? What do those symptoms look like? Do they look like, yeah, trying to self-regulate with food, or do they look like writing, is it more like of a healthier coping skill like Lucia had, like writing letters to her grandmother, or is it like angry outbursts like Alice? So yeah, I was interested in demonstrating that because as you mentioned, as I was writing this book, I was also studying social work to become a psychotherapist. So yeah, just trying to marry all my interests.
Yes, and you absolutely did. You absolutely did. Um, did you find that finding ways that the girls could be friends and connect to each other? You'd mentioned that obviously in your earlier comment. Could you just talk a little bit about growing that part of the story? Because in some ways, the way I think about our work together, it's like you came with the first story intact. We grew it a little bit.
Yeah.
It did grow a little bit, but then we had to grow this to a whole book that included two other girls, and as you say, make them interconnect in a way.
Mhm.
So could you just talk about that a little bit from a process point of view? Because I think the writers in the class would really appreciate that.
Gosh, it's so hard. Um,
Yeah, because I think you originally thought of it's sort of like um it was Lucy, it was that Elisa, right? Because Alice was kind of the outsider, if I recall,
mhm. Yeah.
and nobody liked her because she was sort of really difficult.
Yeah. So what I did, I feel like I kind of wrote them a little bit separately, kind of almost as short stories, but in the same
Right.
world. and then you help me weave them. So I like you would say, and then I would also tell myself while reading your comments, like here would be a good place to put a scene with Elisa and Lucia, or like this is like, or I would mention Lucia in like one sentence, and you would be like expand. Um, and yeah, that's how it felt like um yeah, it definitely it wasn't all like there already, right? It was like a draft after draft, kind of putting more and more and more of each of the girls in each of the stories with your help. Um, and then something that I did, and I think you suggested this, and this was enormously helpful. Like I took a big piece of a big sheet of paper, um, and I even drew each of the girls, and um then put like this line, and like, okay, this is like where like the key plots of the key points of the plot, and like where each other one could be in.
Hmm.
And then like drew a big arc of like, okay, this is the months that it was happening in, like the months of the school year.
Right.
So yeah, like if um they're gonna go, like there's a scene where they Elisa and Lucia go up to the roof, like what's the temperature gonna be, like little things like that, so I could kind of visualize and see like, oh yeah, that's happening in um you know November or whatever. So yeah, kind of like that. Does that make sense? Is that a
Yeah.
little bit clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one last question because I don't want to ask too many questions because I want the students to be able to ask their own questions.
Mm-hmm.
But at least with two of the girls, you're really dealing also with biculturalism in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And they have different relationships to that. And of course, Elisa's coming in as very much a new immigrant, right?
Yeah.
And so forth. Can you just talk a little bit about that portrayal and what you're hoping to convey?
Yeah. Um, I really wanted each of the girls to be their own girl and not have that be the main part of their identity, if that makes sense. Like I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want um Elisa just to be a Salvadorian girl or a refugee,
Right.
or
Right.
Lucia only to be like a Mexican American. I wanted them to really be themselves, and of course that's a huge part of like where you're from is a huge part of who you are, but also in some ways not, and like I wanted them to be very the individual, like their own individuals,
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, um I'm
Yeah.
just trying
One
to
dealing,
know
yeah,
what.
where one is just dealing with a father who, clearly is leaving the mother and, just as
Mm-hmm.
you said, divorce and sort of the mysterious ways that adults are hurting each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Elisa's she's also dealing with this mother who is pregnant with a new baby and, just all of that newness in this
Yeah.
world and living
Yeah.
in New York City and so forth.
Uh-huh. Yeah, like her immigrant experience is, I mean, I wouldn't even call Lucia an immigrant, right? She's born in the United States and just happens
No,
to
no, yeah,
be half and half.
exactly.
Um, so yeah, it's such a different experience. Like I think I really wanted to talk about social class too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel like the conversation right now is a lot about in books and in media, it's a lot about identity and not as much as about social class and how that affects people. I don't know. That's just my perspective,
Yeah, and
but
actually one of the conversations we had, if you recall, was about thinking about the school that they all were at,
yes, yeah,
which
that
would
was
have brought them all together.
yes, yeah.
Like
Uh-huh.
having you really visualize where Elisa lived
Mm-hmm.
versus where Alice and Lucia lived, which is very different. because we
Mm-hmm.
had a number of conversations about that, I remember, is just
Yeah.
making it all work at this public school or this school that they're going to where they would cross paths, though ordinarily they might not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was so glad to have um you in that process to figure that out. And also that wealth of knowledge of working with these um girls because their mothers would do amazing, usually, sometimes fathers, but often mothers would do these amazing navigations through the system to get their kids into like a really nice charter school super far away from their
Right,
neighborhood. Like they
right,
found out ways to work through the system
right,
to
right.
get their kids where they wanted their kids to be, you know.
Yes, exactly. No, that is fantastic. And I remember having those conversations that we just wanted to make sure that it all like worked. And as you say, it's
Mm-hmm.
totally drawing from your knowledge and understanding of that, like in an organic
Mm-hmm.
way,
Mm-hmm.
which is really kind of wonderful.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, no, it's all sort of coming back to me now.
Me too. It's
It's
nice
been a
to
little while
remember it. It's
since
been a
we've
while since I wrote the book, right? The publishing and
exactly,
slow.
exactly. And for those, students, you should know it's this very strange process where there's the writing and then there's the revising and there's the editing and then there's the finding the publisher
Mm-hmm.
um and then there's that whole process and then it comes out and it's quite a while later from
Yeah.
when you're deep inside of it. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's another piece to the process. Um
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to leave it there because I feel like I don't want to use up all the questions. I want to
Yes.
allow the students to
Yeah.
have some questions, but thank you for doing
Oh
this.
my
And we're
gosh.
gonna
Thank you for thinking of me and thank you for, the students who are listening. Thank you for listening and thank you for reading the book. And I feel so honored and it's amazing that people are reading it. Um,
Yeah, well, it's really great and it seemed really perfect for this class. So I'm going to stop the recording just now.